KIRK Collects is now a proud affiliate of GOG.com. GOG is amazing. I've been buying games from them since they launched back in 2008. GOG has a huge selection of DRM-free games, modern titles, as well as retro classics. Many of the games I've featured on this channel can be found there. Turok, System Shock, Dusk, Proteus, you name it. If you're looking to add some titles to your collection, then be sure to use my affiliate link down in the description. It will help this channel out and get you some good old games. Alrighty, let's get this sucker started. What's up, everybody? I'm KIRK, and this is PowerSlave. Originally released back in the mid-90s for consoles, at first glance, PowerSlave might seem like another Doom clone of the era. However, upon closer look, you'll find there's much more to this hidden gem. Taking inspiration from the gameplay stylings of Nintendo, PowerSlave took the item-driven exploration and backtracking of Metroid and combined it with the hard-hitting shooting of Doom, making it one of the most unique shooters of the era, far ahead of its time. And despite becoming a cult classic, in subsequent years the game fell into obscurity. That is until the 2010s, when an unofficial revival effort and the boom of retro-style shooters brought PowerSlave back to the attention of gamers. It's a title I've been eager to talk about ever since I started this channel. And now, by way of Nightdive Studios, I finally have the chance. Now in 2022, PowerSlave has been remastered as PowerSlave Exhumed, unearthing this classic for a whole new audience on a slew of modern systems. In this hunky video, I'll be diving deep into this new version, giving a brief rundown on the history of PowerSlave, going over the extensive work Nightdive put into the remaster, and of course, offering my opinions on the game and whether or not it's worth your time. But before we go and do the biddings of the pharaohs, if you're new here and you're digging what you're seeing, please be sure to like and subscribe to help support this channel. Alrighty, let's exhume. The history of PowerSlave is a little all over the place, a tad convoluted, but nonetheless fascinating. Originally released in 1996 for the Sega Saturn, Sony PlayStation, and PC, it was developed by Lobotomy software and published by Playmates Interactive in North America, with the Saturn version releasing first and the PlayStation following a few months later. In Europe, it was published by BMG Interactive and renamed Exhumed, hence the clever title for the remaster. And in Japan, the game was published as 1999 AD, Resurrection of the Pharaoh. Yeah, that one would have been tricky to fit into the remaster's title. The console versions of PowerSlave are pretty much the same. Both are Metroidvania-style first-person shooters built within Lobotomy's in-house Slave Driver engine, a name that could only fly in the 90s. Slave Driver was notable as it was a fully 3D FPS engine built specifically for consoles. Keep in mind, gaming engines such as these were still uncharted territory at the time. The legendary Quake engine had only debuted on PC a few months before the release of PowerSlave, and the fact that Slave Driver was designed for the consoles was even more unusual, as console FPSs were not held in high regard or taken seriously. Although it wouldn't be long before GoldenEye would change perceptions. A major thing that fascinates me about this game is the fact that it's an early Metroidvania FPS. Not that there's a ton of them, but Metroid Prime is easily the most well-known, and PowerSlave predates it by 6 years. Hell, PowerSlave predates Castlevania Symphony of the Night by a year, which is part of the genre's namesake. I think it's safe to say that PowerSlave is the first of its kind, or at least one of the first of its kind in terms of adhering so closely to the Metroid formula. Some might argue early immersive sims, like System Shock, are the earliest examples of FPS Metroidvania. And true, there's definitely a lot of overlap between ImSims and Metroidvanias. But I have to remind, in something like System Shock, the items required for progression can be found in multiple places and in any order. Whereas in a traditional Metroidvania, they're found in a strict order in set places. Unless you're sequence breaking to speedrun. High amounts of agency define ImSims. Metroidvanias don't really have that. Hexen, which came out a year before PowerSlave, is another one you could cite, but I think that one leans more into action RPG than anything. Whether it was first or not, PowerSlave is historically significant in this regard, which is one of the big reasons why this remaster is so important. Where PowerSlave starts to tread into convolution has to do with the PC version. PC PowerSlave, also developed by Lobotomy, is a completely different game, despite featuring the same premise and art assets. It was created using the Build engine, the same tech that powered games like Duke Nukem 3D and Blood, and was a more traditional first-person shooter, featuring none of the Metroidvania aspects of the console versions. Why did this happen? Well, the truth is, the PC version of PowerSlave was the initial version of the game. In fact, it started out as a project called Ruins, that was going to be published by none other than Apogee Software, to help show off the Build engine, which of course they owned. But during the course of development, Playmates Interactive made a deal with Apogee, buying up the rights for the game to publish themselves. Development remained in the Build engine, and the concept of the game was kept the same. However, in the contract with Playmates, Lobotomy was required to port the game to consoles. The problem was, there were a boatload of issues at the time in getting the Build engine to run properly on both Sega's and Sony's hardware. So Lobotomy said screw it and decided to whip up their own 3D engine specifically for consoles. That's how Slave Driver came to be. And in the course of development, the console version ended up becoming a wholly different experience. That's definitely cool, but it didn't help the game in the long run. It's likely many gamers were unaware of this and assumed console PowerSlave to be a port of the PC version. And seeing as how console ports of FPS games around this time were not held to high regard, it can be speculated console PowerSlave was ignored in favor of the PC version, and why so many gamers have been unaware of it. Sadly, only after 5 years in the industry, Lobotomy would close its doors in 1998. After being acquired by Crave Entertainment, they would start work on a casino game titled Caesar's Palace for the Nintendo 64, and had begun early work on PowerSlave 2. But after only a year of development, Crave cancelled Caesar's Palace, which ultimately spelled the end for Lobotomy. It's a bummer. Lobotomy was a talented and innovative studio, and if they had lasted, I think it's likely they would have made some big waves in the industry. If you want to learn more about Lobotomy, I've linked a few excellent videos from Digital Foundry in the description covering them. In the years following, PowerSlave would go largely forgotten. But then in 2015, like a mummy in a horror movie, the game was unearthed and revived. An unofficial PC port of the console version was released for free by Sam Kaiser via Real. PowerSlave Ex was based on the PlayStation version of the game. Kaiser was able to rip the code and assets from the PlayStation disc, and using his custom engine framework named KEX, which he developed for his previous unofficial PC port of Doom 64, Doom 64X, was able to rebuild console PowerSlave for the PC. PowerSlave Ex brought a host of graphical and quality of life improvements to the nearly forgotten shooter. It re-sparked interest in the game, and for the time, it was considered the optimal way to play console PowerSlave, especially since the console versions were starting to show considerable age and were becoming incredibly expensive and hard to find. Shortly after the release of X, Nightdive Studios acquired the distribution rights of PowerSlave, and Kaiser, who by this point had been hired by the studio, would continue work on it along with improving his KEX engine. Sadly, the X version was taken down soon after, likely for legal reasons, with the promise to fans that an official remaster based on it would be coming. Years later, in 2022, PowerSlave Exhumed was finally released, promising to be the ultimate version of Kaiser's remaster, as well as the ultimate version of PowerSlave proper. Okay, now that we've had the history lesson, let's get into what's been done with this remaster. With the latest version of KEX powering it, Nightdive has brought the console versions of PowerSlave up to modern standards with a host of expected improvements. HD resolutions, widescreen, SMAA, anisotropic filtering, DirectX 11, Vulkan, gamepad support. All the fixings are here and highly tweakable. While there is a clear graphical spit shine, much of the original artwork has been kept the same. Textures and sprites definitely look sharper and might have been cleaned up a little, but for the most part they look identical to their 1996 counterparts. No complaints here. PowerSlave might show its age, but personally I think the game holds up visually. The visuals really sell the feeling of delving into a trap-ridden, curse-riddled tomb, making you feel like Indiana Jones or a contestant on Legends of the Hidden Temple. Overall, longtime fans should be pleased with how the graphics were preserved, and one of the best aspects of this remaster is how much control the player has and how old school the game can look. Nightdive included settings to let players change the lighting to better match the Saturn or PlayStation versions, and you can even make the textures look squiggly, just like in the PlayStation version. Yes, squiggly is my term for it. One robust feature included is the optional CRT filter, with quite the array of settings for the pickiest of nostalgic gamers. I'm not a fan of CRT filters, but even I'll admit this one does look quite good and accurate to the old staticky televisions of my youth. Turn on enough of these settings and you can get this game looking absolutely ancient. Beautifully ancient. One graphical asset that did get an update is the world map, which has been completely redrawn and expanded upon for wider aspect ratios. It's definitely true to the original, but for some reason it just wasn't working for me. I don't think it totally gels with the overall look of the game, and I feel like the detail could have been pushed further in some spots. However, you do have the option to switch it out for the original map, which I still think looks pretty cool, so I can only complain so much here. The only blemish I encountered was this right here. I pressed up against the wall and some geometry glitched out. That's it. And honestly, I only found this by chance. Audio is one area the original PowerSlave excelled at, and even today holds up incredibly. Sound effects were deep and beefy, yet also very sharp, and the soundtrack was absolutely fire. For the remaster, Nightdive kept everything preserved, and seems to have cleaned some stuff up and balanced everything out with some EQ, making the weapon fire a little less bassy. The audio doesn't jump out at you quite as much as in the original, but everything does sound more even. Here's some comparisons. All in all, PowerSlave Exhumed is typical of the high quality Nightdive puts into its remasters. However, to really appreciate the work put into this remaster is to understand the differences between the Saturn and PlayStation versions, and how Nightdive embraced them. The Saturn version of PowerSlave is the original version of the game. The PlayStation version is the port. And while both versions are similar, the fact of the matter is, the PlayStation and the Saturn were very different from each other in terms of hardware, with specific quirks and limitations. To bring PowerSlave to Sony's little gray box, Lobotomy had to make a lot of changes and tweaks, largely so the game could perform well. Some of these changes were downgrades, but some also improved the overall experience, to the point where you could argue the merits of the PlayStation version over the Saturn version. So, in approaching this project, Nightdive examined both versions carefully, picked the best aspects of each, and combined them. In a way, PowerSlave Exhumed is not so much a remaster, but rather a remix. A remix that aims to be the ultimate expression of this cult shooter. Some of the differences between the two versions are minor in the grand scheme of things, but are no less interesting. For example, throughout the game you receive your objectives from the ghost of King Ramses, who definitely gives off some strong Zordon vibes.
For centuries I lived in splendid afterlife, among the most powerful gods of the world.
In the Saturn version, Ramsey's mouth is fully animated, whereas in the PlayStation version, those lips are tight.
The mighty sandals and Comtet give you the strength to leap higher than mortal humans.
PowerSlave Exhumed incorporates the fully animated Ramses. Water is another thing to note. The Saturn version's water is rough, to say the least. The system was incapable of rendering transparency, and thus what we have here is a messy, white checkered surface with a simple animated texture over it. In the PlayStation version, the water was vastly improved. It has a true transparent surface that also ripples and moves. This style of water was adopted for the remaster. The goofiest difference between the two has to do with the bug enemies. Saturn PowerSlave featured red spiders, and in PlayStation PowerSlave, they were changed to blue scorpions. Apparently, this was something pushed by Sony, who wanted ports from other systems to have a certain amount of changed or exclusive content to entice buyers. Yeah, I'm sure it made a big difference. Therefore, the remaster features both red spiders and blue scorpions. How about that? The glaring differences between the two versions, however, is in their level design. PlayStation PowerSlave's levels compared to the Saturn's were vastly simplified in complexity. Rooms are smaller, ceilings are lower, and larger rooms commonly have walls dividing them. Once again, this was done because of certain limitations in the PlayStation hardware. To Lobotomy's credit, though, whenever they did change something in the PlayStation version, they more often than not tried to add in some sort of new gameplay element to make up for it. Typically an obstacle, trap, enemy placement, or secret. Even when a change technically made a level inferior to the original, they were always striving to find ways to make the experience better regardless. For PowerSlave Exhumed, the levels, for the most part, retain the original layouts and geometry of the Saturn version. But where things get fun, and where Nightdive truly plays video game DJ, is that the developer was not afraid to take the unique aspects of the PlayStation level design and mix them with the Saturn level design. A great example of this is in Karnak's Sanctuary. At the beginning of the level in the Saturn version, you come into this wide clearing with the entrance to the sanctuary. The M60 is sitting there in front along with the first symbol, key. You enter the sanctuary and the level goes on from there. In the PlayStation version, the clearing has been shrunk God damn it! Stupid Hawks. Sorry about that. In the PlayStation version, the clearing has been shrunk considerably. In fact, it's pretty much gone. However, the sanctuary entrance now sports a new look with more detail, giving it a sort of Petra vibe. The M60 is now found when you enter the sanctuary, and when you pick it up, you're ambushed by two enemies. A good example of what I was saying before in how Lobotomy strove to add gameplay with their changes. So, how did Nightdive DJ these differences? Well, in the remaster, the wide clearing has been brought back, but the sanctuary entrance visually matches the look of the PlayStation version, and the M60 ambush is here too. Neat, right? And if you allow me another example, we should also talk about Zobek's Pass. In the Saturn version, Zobek's Pass is a deep, narrow canyon of orange stone. There's a sense of grandeur to it, especially with the blue skybox above the tall rocks, one of the game's more visually effective levels. On the PlayStation, however, the narrow canyons have been turned into claustrophobic dark brown caves, with only a few spots where you can see the sky. It's a similar layout compared to the Saturn version, but overall it's not nearly as visually interesting. On the PlayStation though, this level featured a different beginning. On the Saturn, you start right in the canyon, whereas on PlayStation, you start in a hallway full of pots with what appears to be no exit. The player has to find a secret wall which leads into this room sporting a cool looking ankh, which then leads into the canyon. In PowerSlave Exhumed, Zobek's is exactly as it was on the Saturn, with the canyon looking grand. But it also features the PlayStation entrance. To some of you, this might not seem like that big of a deal, but for a longtime PowerSlave fan, this is a lot of fun to see, and I think Nightdive deserves a lot of praise for taking the time to do something like this. They could have just remastered the Saturn version and we all would have been perfectly happy. But no, they strove to represent both versions, and in my opinion, the final product is all the better for it. Alrighty, so clearly this remaster is killing it visually. But how does the gameplay hold up? Well, like I said earlier, PowerSlave is a mashup of Doom and Metroid. At first blush, it's typical of a 90s shooter. Levels are somewhat maze-like, and collecting keys to unlock doors, along with switch puzzles, are the primary ways to progress to the end. But while exploring, you might notice a ledge that's too high to jump on, or a ravine of acid that seems to lead somewhere but will kill you on contact. Yeah, some of you might see where this is going. Play long enough and you'll eventually come across artifacts that will allow you to tackle such obstacles. The sandals here let you jump higher, the anklets let you withstand both lava and acid, and the mask allows you to hold your breath longer underwater. Backtrack and traverse these obstacles and you'll discover new paths that lead to new levels. Further exploration will reveal hidden red onks, which increase your health, not unlike Metroid's energy tanks, and the components of a transmitter which must be restored in order to earn the good ending. This hybrid FPS Metroidvania approach is just awesome. Lobotomy pulled this off beautifully. I always know I'm playing a good Metroidvania when I start getting obsessed with it. Every time I gained an ability, I was eager to go back and uncover the new possibilities. This is definitely the type of game that can suck you in for hours without you even realizing it. Unsurprisingly, little has been changed in the remaster in terms of core gameplay and mechanics, but there are improvements. Obviously, full mouse look has been implemented, which may not seem like that big of a deal, but I can imagine many PowerSlave fans going, "Thank God." My previous experience with this game was in the PlayStation version, and while that rendition is far from the worst controlling FPS I've played on the console, it was released before the debut of the DualShock controller. And for you youngins out there, what that means is that movement was done with the D-pad, which was brutal on the thumbs. And to look up and down meant you had to hold down a face button and hold up or down on the D-pad, which was awkward and made platforming real irritating. PowerSlave features a ton of platforming, which is another aspect that made it unusual for its day, as most other shooters avoided it altogether. The platforming sections are actually really well done, but having to point the camera down to see where you're going while also contending with enemies and hazards made for platforming that got so frustrating it tempted me to chuck the game disc into the river and be done with it. Having that mouse precision took the frustration down a huge notch, and allowed me to enjoy the platforming so much more and really appreciate the design of it. The difficulty has been expanded. Where the original had only one difficulty, the remaster features 3. Normal is pretty much the original difficulty, while Hard and Pharaoh turn up the heat considerably, making enemies stronger, numerous, and featuring the tougher types earlier. I did my initial playthrough on Hard and then played through a good chunk of the game on Pharaoh. I would recommend starting out on either of these for a seasoned FPS player. The challenge was more than satisfying, although there is a drawback to these difficulties, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Last, there is the checkpoint system. Yay! The original PowerSlave was very old school in that if you died, you had to start at the beginning of the level. Progress was only saved when you reached the exit. This, of course, made the later, more platforming-intensive levels outright maddening, as the smallest mistake could mean losing tons of progress. The checkpoints are placed logically throughout each level, and pop up right when you need them, with the really, really tricky late-game levels featuring a generous amount of them. Part of me wishes a standard quick saving system was here instead, but the checkpoints are a good compromise to keep the difficult old school charm intact. In terms of first-person shooting, PowerSlave is strong. Shooting feels good and punchy, and movement is fast and responsive. And I think Nightdive might have cranked up the movement speed a little over the original versions, which I would say is an improvement. Honestly guys, in terms of mechanics, I have nothing to complain about. The arsenal gets high marks from me too. The pistol and burstfire M60 will be the go-to workhorses. Not so much for their damage, but rather the accuracy and range. And the flamethrower is a great tool for clearing out rooms and animal control. The Egyptian-themed weapons, though, are where it's at. The Cobra Staff is a powerhouse, blasting out homing green energy snakes balanced out by a low ammo count. And the Ring of Ra, which puts our hero in what looks like Pepe Le Pew mode, shoots out a flurry of bouncing flak that can decimate a room. But my favorite of them all are the Anom bombs. These are basically grenades, but what I like about them is that they feel similar to the dynamite bundles from Blood, meaning the longer you charge these up, the further they go, and once you get a feel for them, they can be invaluable for dealing with tricky enemy placements, and the best part, they can one-shot some of the tougher enemies. Plus, they're the one weapon integral to progression, as they can blow up walls. And who doesn't love blowing up a wall and finding a secret passage? A cool thing to note is that while each weapon has its own ammo pool, the blue orb pickups can restore ammo to any of them. A simplification to the FPS formula on Lobotomy's part that I feel benefits the game. A player will still have to manage their ammo, but they're free to use any weapon type they want, not ignoring one for the other because the ammo for it is limited. If it makes sense to go through a whole level using only the flamethrower and bombs, then the game won't stop you. The enemy roster puts up a fierce challenge. Jackal-headed zombies that lob out fireballs are the typical foe, and easy enough to take out with best practices. But the mummies that shoot red homing snakes and the wild cheetah girls can make short work of you if you're not careful. This probably won't shock anyone, but my least favorite enemies is the army of pest types. The scorpions and spiders, which infest this entire game from start to finish, aren't terrible, just a bit annoying, especially when they sneak up on you and start biting like you're a hunk of meat seasoned with sugar. But the piranha can go straight to hell. The carnivorous fish are ferocious, and since most weapons can't be used underwater, your common option is to take them on with the machete, which isn't great, and more often than not, attacking them always leads to unnecessary loss of health. The trick I found is to keep swimming backwards while attacking so they don't have a chance to bite you. Or if you can, wade on the surface and just shoot the stupid things. In all, returning to PowerSlave was a treat. That being said, during the course of my playthrough, I was reminded that this game is kind of some bullshit. Whoa, what happened there? This is a difficult game. Actually, it's more appropriate to say it's a tricky son of a bitch. It can be cheap, and first-time players will certainly die a lot. Seriously, so glad we have the checkpoints. PowerSlave's difficulty stems from two things: hitboxes and level design. I don't know if it's the hitbox around your character or the hitboxes around the projectiles, but what I do know is that they are generously wide. Fireballs that look like they should miss you will hit you, and enemies can hurt you at a further distance than you'd expect, like these cheetah girls that seem to be swiping me from a full few feet away. You might notice in my gameplay me getting the hell out of the way of anything coming at me, because it is so easy to get dinged in this game, and what exacerbates this is the constrictive level design. Despite broadly using Saturn geometry, which is more spacious, there's a lot of spots in this game where there's not a lot of room to maneuver in combat. For instance, if you're going down a hallway and there's a zombie parked at the end shooting fireballs, you have to backtrack out of there because there is no way to get around them. And no, you can't crouch in this game. And all enemies, no matter how small, can block player movement. So if you're fighting multiple enemies in a room and are trying to jump out of the way of an attack, if a locust or a hawk happens to be right there, you can easily get sandwich trapped and wiped out in a matter of seconds. And the downside of the higher difficulties is that with increased enemy counts comes the increase of cheap deaths, and for many players, especially first-time players, this will cause them to inch through the game with the utmost caution, which is not always the funnest thing. To be fair, these levels are largely fun to play through and explore, but this aspect can make PowerSlave a frustrating play. I did find myself growing impatient with it, particularly in the late game. But what really drives me nuts in this game are the pots. The freaking pots, man. Throughout the game, there are breakable pots in a multitude of different styles, and as you might suspect, breaking these pots will give the player health and ammo pickups. But sometimes they can be dangerous. Breaking a pot might reveal an enemy insect, and since the pots are randomized, there's always a chance of danger. But here's the thing. The pots become more dangerous as you progress through the game. It starts with bugs, but then pots can shoot out green snakes, just like the Cobra Staff shoots out, and eventually bouncing fireballs like from the Ring of Ra. Yeah, nothing like being almost dead trying to find health and a pot kills you. Seriously, look at the amount of hurt that flies from destroying these pots. If you're wondering why I'm shooting the pots instead of breaking them with my sword, that's why. Eventually, it becomes too dangerous to break these things up close, and since pots are a key method of healing and getting ammo, you're always having to contend with this, and it gets really old. Honestly, I just find it unnecessary. This doesn't add good challenge to the game, it just makes it cheaper, especially when a pot accidentally breaks during combat and ends up killing you. Does all this ruin the game? Hardly. I still think PowerSlave is amazing, well-designed, fun, and worth anyone's time that wants to play it. But this is something to keep in mind for new players or those who just aren't patient with old-school design. I've said it before in my other Nightdive reviews, and I'll say it again here. The beauty of this studio is that they not only revive games, they archive them. Console PowerSlave was a game trapped on a pair of long-retired systems with no other way to access it other than tracking down the disc or emulating. And now it's been made easily accessible for the foreseeable future and plays better than ever. There are aspects of PowerSlave's design that are frustrating, but at the end of the day, this is a unique, fun, and historically significant shooter. When we talk about the best shooters of the 90s, specifically the best console shooters of the 90s, it's a game that deserves to be in the conversation more. If you love Metroidvanias and old-school first-person shooters, this one is 100% worth your time, especially if you're a Metroid Prime fan. But that's all from me today. What do you think of PowerSlave Exhumed? And what are your thoughts on the Metroidvania FPS? And are there others that you know about that should be on my radar? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed the video, please be sure to subscribe, like, and ring the bell for notifications on future uploads. It's a couple clicks for you, but a massive help for this channel. And don't be shy, come say hi in the KIRK Collects Discord, linked below. And be sure to check out my affiliate links. I'm KIRK, and thank you for watching this video. Stay safe out there.